Dear Your Excellency, Moshe Arens, Your Excellency, the Israeli Ambassador in Prague, magnificence, spectacular, dear colleagues, dear friends. It's a great honor for me to warmly welcome on Charles University Moshe Arense, the Israeli politician and diplomat who served as the Minister of Defense and also Minister of Foreign Affairs. Once also in the period which we are celebrating at the time, it is the 25th anniversary of the new restart of the cooperation and friendship between the Czech Republic or former Czechoslovakia and Israel. Most of us know that the traditional cooperation and friendship between the Czechoslovakia and Israel was done at the beginning of the Israeli state in variety and plenty areas of support and cooperation as supporting the Israel government and Israeli people during the different wars, and this restart of cooperation 25 years ago, it's starting the new era and new dynamism of cooperation between the universities, between the economy, between the economics, politicians area, and also in other areas which are important from both country and countries supporting together. I think the basic democratic principles which are important for us, and I think that we also this week starting the Israeli Week on our university with different activities and lectures, which was done by different departments of our university. As I mentioned before, we have 17 schools, half of them focusing for bioscience, medicine, pharmacy, mathematics and physics, and there are very strong cooperation between the universities in Israel, as Hebrew University in Jerusalem and other institutions. And the second part, it is the faculties focusing for social sciences, philosophy, pedagogy, law, and also, as mentioned, there are two representatives which are strongly connected to the Israeli land, as former Vice Rector Professor Prudký from Protestant faculty, where is a very strong center for biblical studies, and Professor Lášek from Husit Theology faculty, where is a traditional studies on Judaism, and also the study of history and Judaism are on the Faculty of Philosophy and Faculty of Arts, which is a traditional how it's and strongly cooperate with our Israeli partners. I will shortly introduce you for the auditorium, that you are not only in part the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Moshe Arens born in 1925 in Lithuania, moving to United States in 1939. He studied the mechanical engineering and Massachusetts Institute of Technology and aeronautical engineering at the California Institute of Technology. And shortly before Israel declared the independence, Arens again moved with his family to the Jewish state and working here and founding the member of the Herod political party. From 62 until 71, Arens was the Deputy Director General in Israel Aircraft Industries and won the Israel Defense Prize in 1971. After the Yom Kippur War in 73, he entered politics and was elected to the Knesset as a member of Likud in the 1973 elections. After being re-elected in 77, he became a chairman of Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. He was re-elected to Knesset in 81, but resigned from his seat to serve as Israeli ambassador in United States of America. After returning back, he was appointed as a Minister of Defense, replacing Ariel Sharon, and after re-elections. Arens was this time in 1984, at this time appointed minister without portfolio. Any other re-elections was appointed Ministry for Foreign Affairs with Benjamin Netanyahu as his deputy, and in 1990 was returned to the Ministry of Defense portfolio, position held until 1999, he retiring from political life. Now he is currently chairman of International Board of Governors of Ariel University Center of Samaria. We are very honored that during your official visit in our country you have spent a few time with our academic community, and thank you once again to coming to the Charles University. Thank you.
Well, Mr. President and Mr. Ambassador and honored professors, good afternoon. I assume that everybody here speaks English, yes, so everybody will understand, because I don't speak a word of Czech. This is not the first time that I'm in Prague. Actually, it's the third time. The first time was 25 years ago, when I came here as foreign minister to sign the renewal of diplomatic relations between what was then Czechoslovakia and Israel. I had the honor of meeting the president, Václav Havel. We have a long relationship, long in terms of Israel's existence, between Israel and Czechoslovakia, even before the State of Israel was established. As I'm sure you know, Thomas Masaryk was one of the European statesmen who was a very strong supporter of Zionism before Israel was established. And in 1948, after the State of Israel was declared and the surrounding Arab armies invaded Israel, and the small Jewish community was fighting for its life, we really had one friend, and that was Czechoslovakia. If we had not received arms shipments from Czechoslovakia that year, if we had not received some fighter aircraft from Czechoslovakia at that time, if we had not had the opportunity for our young men to learn how to fly and how to become pilots here in Czechoslovakia, who knows what the outcome of our war of independence would have been. So it really started with a relationship on a very high level of friendship, of intimacy, but as you know, it didn't stay that way. Under the Soviet rule in all of Eastern Europe and in Czechoslovakia, we had the Purge trials here in Prague, in which some of the people who were tried were accused of being Zionist spies. And then in 1967, under orders from Moscow, the relations were abrogated. And so for a period of 23 years, from 67 to 1970 to 1990, it was a freeze. I know not because that is what the Czechs wanted, but that is what the people in Moscow wanted. And I think it's significant that as soon as the Soviet rule was thrown off in all of the Eastern European countries, of course in Czechoslovakia as well, one of the first things that was done by Czechoslovakia, by Hungary, by Poland, by Bulgaria, was to rush and renew diplomatic relations with Israel, as if it was something that they had wanted and yearned for a long period of time, but were not in a position to implement. And once they were free, they went ahead and did it. I met Václav Havel here in Prague in February, and I greeted him when he came to Israel in April of 1990. And I still remember him coming off the plane. It was a very hot day, what we in Israel call a khamsin, a desert wind blowing. He comes off the plane, he takes off his jacket, and he says to me, "Can we go to the beach?" I said, "Mr. President, we can't go to the beach. We have many ceremonies that you have to attend in Jerusalem." So we got in the car and we went to Jerusalem. I talked about Israel's War of Independence. In 1948, when Israel was literally fighting for its life. But Israel has really literally been at war ever since. Surrounded by hostile neighbors, by dictatorial regimes, many of them pledged to the destruction of the State of Israel. So after the war of 1948, they were concluded by signing armistice agreements, not peace agreements, armistice agreements. There was the war of 1956 when Egypt blockaded the Straits of Eilat. There was a war of 1967 when Egypt, Syria, and Jordan invaded Israel, the Six-Day War. And there was 6 years later, although many in Israel thought that that would be the last war, considering the brilliant victory of the Israel Defense Forces, 6 years later we were at war again, in the Yom Kippur War, a very difficult war for Israel, a war which started on what you might consider optimal conditions for the aggressors, in that Israel was caught by surprise, attacked from the north and from the south by Egypt and by Syria, before it had a chance to mobilize its reserves, so outnumbered and outgunned. But within 18 days, it was a great victory in military terms. The Israeli army stood at 101 kilometers from Cairo and within artillery range of Damascus. And that was the beginning of the first peace treaty that we have signed with Egypt. Not immediately, but within a few years, by 1978, Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel. I think in no small measure because of the victory that was scored by the Israeli army and the understanding in Egypt that they did not have a chance of beating Israel on the battlefield. That is what we call deterrence. The realization that it's no use trying to use force, it will only boomerang on the aggressor. And we have not had a war on the battlefield since then, since 1973. So this is now over 40 years. Not with Egypt, of course, we are at peace with Egypt. Not with Jordan, which signed a peace treaty with us a few years later. Not with Syria, although we did not sign a peace treaty with Syria. But still, the Syrian dictator did not dare to attack Israel, knowing full well that he was heading straight for defeat. Israel's military victory was not the end of hostility towards Israel. And when it became clear to Israel's enemies that they could not defeat us on the battlefield, they turned to a new wave of hostility, of belligerence, namely terrorism. Hijacking of aircraft, the murder of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympic Games, and then the use of suicide bombers. There was a period in Israel between the year 2000 and 2002, so that's 15 years ago, when mothers were afraid to send their children to school, and people were afraid to ride on buses or to attend wedding ceremonies, because suicide bombers would come right into our cities and blow themselves up. It's not the right appellation, but suicide bombers are a very effective weapon. They're very accurate. They hit you exactly where they want to hit you by coming into your midst with an explosive belt tied around them. Israel defeated that wave of terror by moving the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, into Judea and Samaria, into the West Bank, into the area from which the terrorists came into our cities. And we have had incidents since then, but nothing like the wave of terror that hit us in those years, 15 years ago. In Israel, we are convinced that were the Israeli army to withdraw from these areas, from the West Bank, the terror would return. It's only our presence, the presence of our soldiers, uncomfortable, not very pleasant, criticized in many quarters in the world, that's kept the terror out of our cities. The terror by suicide bombers, by individual assassins, has been reinforced now with the use of ballistic missiles. Ballistic missiles have come a long way since the V2 of World War II. They are a terror weapon. They are fired against civilian targets, not against military targets. They are not very accurate. But when they're fired against a city or a town or a village, many people can get hurt. So we've had to deal with rockets and missiles being fired from the Gaza Strip, which was evacuated by the Israeli army in the expectation that this would be a step towards peace. It turned out to be a step towards further hostility, to increase danger to the people living in the southern part of Israel. We've had missiles and rockets being fired from the north by Hezbollah. Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, now also involved in the fighting in Syria, has over 100,000 rockets and missiles, all directed against Israel. We like to think that we can deter them from launching them, but you can never be sure. So Israel is on alert daily against the possibility of terror weapons being directed against Israel. And there's one more terror weapon, the most terrible of all, the ultimate terror weapon, and that's a missile with a nuclear bomb. We know, you know, everybody knows that the Iranians are working very hard to achieve a nuclear weapon, that the Iranians have developed and acquired ballistic missiles with a range that can hit Israel, and even ranges beyond Israel, that the Iranians insist that it is their aim to destroy the state of Israel. So here's the ultimate terror weapon with which we have to contend. This is the reason why we are so concerned with the framework agreement that has been negotiated recently between the permanent members of the Security Council, United States, China, Russia, France, England, plus Germany, with the Iranians, because that agreement leaves the Iranians, in effect gives legitimacy to the tremendous infrastructure tremendous nuclear infrastructure, tens of thousands of centrifuges for the enrichment of uranium that the Iranians have put together in the last few years with the obvious intent of trying to attain nuclear weaponry. But everybody negotiating with them is prepared to act as if what they're saying, that all they are eager to do is use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, as if this was really true. So when the framework agreement provides legitimacy to their infrastructure, does not call for its dismantlement, you will understand why we in Israel are concerned. Very, very concerned. The countries around Israel for many, many years were ruled by dictators. Democratic countries don't like dictators. You don't like dictators. We don't like dictators. But we have to accept this is a fact. Egypt was ruled by dictators. Syria was ruled by dictators. Iraq was ruled by a dictator. There are many disadvantages to dictatorial rule, as I'm sure you know. Many disadvantages to the people who are ruled by the dictators, who are denied their freedom. There is, under the circumstances prevailing in the Middle East, there was one advantage, and that is that dictators could make their will prevail. Dictators could be deterred because dictators are concerned about losing their power, and that is what interests them, if they start an aggressive war and are defeated. So when Egypt decided to sign a peace treaty with Israel, Sadat, with all the compliments that are showered upon him as being the man who was prepared to do it after so many years of hostility, was a dictator. And the man that followed him, Mubarak, was a dictator. He was, as a dictator, was able to implement a peace treaty with Israel, whether the people liked it or not. And most people in Egypt did not like it. And possibly even today, many people in Egypt don't like it, don't like the peace treaty with Israel. But a dictator can implement that decision once he has taken it. And the rulers of Jordan, with a lot of sympathy that we have for them for good reason, not a democratic regime, they are capable of maintaining a peace with Israel, even if many people in Jordan do not like the idea. And Hafez al-Assad, who was the dictator in Syria, now we have his son, Bashar al-Assad, who's in big trouble. Hafez al-Assad began initial negotiations with Israel that were never consummated, but we did know one thing: he was in a position to implement a treaty if he were to sign it, because he ruled Syria. Now, as I'm sure you know, there are big changes in the Middle East in the last few years. Some of the dictators are gone. Saddam Hussein is gone in Iraq. Bashar al-Assad in Syria is fighting for his life. Iraq and Syria hardly exist today as political entities. So when we ask ourselves, and when you ask us, what are the chances of making progress towards peaceful settlements in the area? The fact that the dictators are gone, that Arabs are killing Arabs and Sunnis are fighting Shia, that hundreds of thousands of people are being killed, has not improved the chances of Israel reaching peace with any more Arab neighbors. It has made things more difficult, and that seems like a paradox. Because you think that when the dictator is gone, it will become easier, but it's become more difficult. Much of the attention on the peace process with Israel is focused on the Palestinians. I think many do not understand that the conflict with Israel, the hostility towards Israel, is really three-dimensional. It is hostility of the Islamic world towards Israel. It is the hostility of the Arab world towards Israel. It is the hostility of the Palestinians towards Israel. And when you see this problem in three dimensions, you realize how difficult it is to arrive at an end of the conflict. We arrived at a peace treaty with Egypt. It was not the end of the conflict. We have had, and still have, peaceful relations with Turkey, a Muslim country. Not so good right now under Erdogan, but still better than war. It's not the end of the conflict. When Israel goes to the United Nations, we go there knowing that there is an automatic majority for any move or resolution against the state of Israel. The Arab countries, the Muslim countries, and others associated with them have a majority. That's how they passed the resolution calling calling Zionism racism. The resolution was revoked, as you probably know, but they could pass it again if they decided that that is what they wanted to do. Some people think that if Israel could only reach a conciliation or an agreement with the Palestinians, the problem would be over. And maybe at first sight, from a myopic point of view, it sounds like that would settle it. As I said, if you look at the other dimensions of the conflict, you know that that's not the case. But it's worse than that. The Palestinians are a dysfunctional political entity. The head of the Palestinian Authority, who sits in Ramallah, Mahmoud Abbas, does not speak for all the Palestinians. Hamas, which rules Gaza, and some of the polls indicate that if there were to be free elections in the West Bank, Hamas would win these elections, does not accept Abbas's authority to make peace with Israel, does not agree to negotiate with Israel or to make peace with Israel. So even if Israel were to reach an agreement with Abbas, that would not be the end of the conflict. There would be lots more Palestinians, and Palestinians with weapons, and Palestinian terrorists, and Palestinians with missiles, who would say, we do not recognize this agreement. And what presumably many people think is a prior condition for an agreement with Mahmoud Abbas, certainly not the only one, the withdrawal of the Israeli army from the West Bank. And I've already indicated to you what the consequence of that would be. Rockets on Tel Aviv. Another consequence. Mahmoud Abbas would probably not survive if the Israeli army was not in the West Bank. So I think you understand that when we talk about resolving the conflict, we're talking about a process. There's no instant solution. All of us would like to instantly solve problems when we face them. We know that there are problems that have no solutions, and there are problems for which the solution is a long way off and requires a process. Certainly bringing about an end to the conflict between Israel and its neighbors and Israel and the Islamic world is a long-term process. Now we are under pressure, we in Israel. I'm sure you and the Czech Republic are aware of it. It comes from the President of the United States, Barack Obama. It comes from the European Union, of which you are a member. That Israel withdraw to the 67 borders. The 67 borders are the 1949 armistice lines. And I've already indicated to you what that withdrawal would mean. And when we are called upon to do that, when we hear about Mahmoud Abbas, who, as I said, is really not in position to reach an agreement with Israel, I think this is the reason why he is not really interested in negotiating with Israel, going to the United Nations and trying to have the Security Council pass a resolution that a Palestinian state must be established in the 1967 borders. We in Israel, and maybe some of you in Prague as well, think back to 1938. When England and France decided that the areas of the Sudetenland, important for the defense of Czechoslovakia, should be separated arbitrarily. And the Czech people were left no choice. So I know that history does not repeat itself, but there are some analogies and there are some lessons to be learned from these analogies. And when we are being pressured to give up control over areas that are very important to our defense, and that might lead to a renewed wave of terrorism into Israel's cities, we try to explain it to our friends. And I understand that the Czech Republic is maybe our best friend in the European Union. So you can be our ambassadors. And I think that you probably, better than any European country, will understand our position. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much for a very interesting speech to looking some correlation between the past history of Czechoslovakia, and I believe that not the present situation, that the problem will be solved peacefully for our countries and for your citizens. And thank you once again to coming and join with us your experiences for the Israeli policy in the past and your view to the future. And we must be optimistic that the future will be peaceful. Thank you.